No, I can do it. I figured it out. Oh, you already did it. Or is that me?
That's you.
It's okay. Okay. Nada's gonna take the lead. Can you hear me? Lorena and Michelle? Okay. Hi, good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. So I would like to introduce Michelle Dion. Michelle is a professor of political science at McMaster University. She specializes in comparative political economy, comparative political behavior, and research design and methodology. Her research has appeared in Comparative Politics, International Studies Quarterly, Journal of Latin American Studies, and in many other important outlets. Um, Michelle has also been a Fulbright scholar and visiting professor at CIDE in Mexico, and also at the Instituto Tecnológico de Monterrey. Between 2020 and 2024, Michelle was an editor at the American Political Science Review, one of the top journals in our field. And she kindly agreed to talk to us about the journal submission and review process, insights from the American Political Science Review. So, Michelle, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us. We are looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nada, for that introduction, and to Lorena and Rebecca for coordinating and organizing. You can hear me okay? All right, excellent. So as Nada mentioned, I recently just ended a term with 9 other women editing the American Political Science Review. And during that time, my primary responsibility was a mix of methodology papers, so papers that developed new quantitative or computational methods for political science, but I also handled many comparative politics papers, particularly if they did have kind of heavy quantitative or computational elements to them. And given the collaborative way that our editorial team worked, I also worked very closely with Eileen Tripp and Elizabeth Wood, who were the two other comparativists who were on our team and who handled the bulk of papers that were in the field of comparative politics. So we were your editors for the last 4 years. So I'm going to cover a little bit of the same ground that Nada covered this morning, but with a slightly different focus. And I'm going to try to not talk too quickly because I do tend to speak very quickly. And I'm very sorry that I can't be there with you in person. I thought for sure that if I planned to arrive on a Saturday, that if something went wrong, I could get there on a Sunday and still be there to join you. But it turns out that the world is not as globalized as we think it is, because there was no way that Delta said they could get me there on time for today. So I appreciate that Nada and Lorena have and Rebecca, I mean, have gone through to great lengths to bring Lorena and I there virtually. So I hope that also that we'll have time for some conversation and questions, maybe things that I didn't answer or questions that have arisen over the course of the day that we can talk about at the end to get kind of multiple different perspectives. So I'm going to talk about a number of different things, including why we publish, how to find the right journal for your paper, and then probably the thing that most people are interested in is kind of what did I learn while I was an editor of the APSR. And I'm already kind of giving away the headline here, or the takeaway, which is that when you publish in English language journals, your work actually kind of gets the same attention and citations and recognition that your peers that are perhaps native English speakers or who are always publishing in English language journals get. And so it really is a great opportunity for you to enhance your reach and impact of your work. So I want to start with just kind of an obvious question, which is, why do we bother publishing in these types of journals. We can have lots of different reasons. Some of them are kind of our personal motivations, how we, satisfaction, pride, the opportunity to make an impact. I'm going to see if I can, there we go, increase my font size. We can want the recognition of our peers. We want maybe more career leverage, better pay. We want to get a better job, get a job. We want to be an example for others. We want to increase our chances of getting research funding in the future. We may want to influence the direction of our discipline or policy. And there, are other motivations potentially, but I want to start this way by pointing out that, not every paper is going to find a home in the APSR or can fit in a journal like the APSR. But also you might, at different stages of your career or for different papers, have different motivations for publishing them in different venues. And so I just want to acknowledge at the beginning that we can think about a bunch of different reasons why it might actually, in some instances, make sense to publish in, say, a national Brazilian journal or a specialized journal or the like. Are we good?
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out if I can make it bigger, but you can keep on talking while I do that. Sorry.
Okay. I can try to increase my fonts some. Is that better?
Yeah, that is good.
Okay. I think I'll just have to do that on every slide probably as I go through. But I'll also hopefully have some pretty pictures that you can just look at instead. So how do we choose where to publish our research? Well, first, we usually want to start with what are our primary motivations for publishing this paper? Who are we trying to speak to or influence? Which is, again, another way of saying that sometimes, a Brazilian journal might make more sense if you're trying to influence local policymakers. But if you're trying to, gain fame and fortune, maybe you do want to try to pitch your work to an English language journal. So do you want an international or national audience? Are you thinking about academic, policy, or other public audiences? Who are you interested in speaking to? Maybe your work is more interdisciplinary, or maybe it is right in the core of a subfield. And so you want to be engaged in a conversation with other people in your subfield. I've sent in the slides here, so they'll be able to send them around to you after the session. And I have a couple of links here that you can click on to go see what I'm talking about. But we recently held a workshop at McMaster where we had some people come and talk about how to come up with a communications plan for your project overall. And there's a useful video and a worksheet that can help you kind of work through how to promote your research. But I want to focus mostly here on the challenge of maximizing visibility of our research within the constraints of formal and informal institutions, right? Because we're political scientists, we know about formal and informal institutions. And those are often constraints on our ability to make sure that our research kind of reaches the maximum or the largest size audience possible. So formal institutions or formal constraints here, I'm talking about the scope of a particular journal, their submission guidelines, their word count, the rules basically around whether or not you can publish your work in that journal. But then there are a lot of informal constraints. And these are usually norms, or sometimes it's called the hidden curriculum. So these are certain things that are not visible or apparent necessarily. They don't write it on their journal webpage. So you have to read between the lines. You have to ask other political scientists. You have to ask your advisors. So certain journals will privilege certain, not epidemiological, but epistemological. So that's a mistake there. That should be epistemological or methodological approaches. right? So some journals, for instance, are more likely to publish quantitative work and have an emphasis on causal inference, and other journals might be more open to interpretive work or work that is more qualitative and has a different inferential aim. So one example that comes to mind right away is the difference between comparative political studies and comparative politics, right? Comparative political studies as a journal has a reputation for publishing quantitative work, having an emphasis on causal explanations and rigor, whereas comparative politics is another great comparative politics field journal, but is more known for being open to qualitative approaches and qualitative case studies. And so that's just one example of how the journals won't necessarily on their front page say, I'm pausing just 1 second. My audio seemed to do something funny. I think it might be okay now. But that's an example, one example of how journals won't actually say what their primary focus is in some respects on their webpage, but you have to look through the journal and become familiar with kind of the hidden norms for that journal. The other thing is that a lot of these journals have different expectations when it comes to novelty and rigor, and how they define rigor and how they define novelty. And so I'm going to talk more about this, particularly in the context of choosing which journal you want to submit your work to, because at the APSR, it turns out that novelty is a very important criteria for publishing there. So there are also other subtle cues or ways to signal status, not only of the journal itself, but of the work as you prepare the work. And so these can be things as mundane as how you format figures, whether or not it's clear to reviewers or they can intuit what software you use for your statistical analyses and things like that. And so there are all these very subtle, unwritten rules of the game that shape how peer reviewers and editors are going to interpret your work and how your work will or won't fit in with particular journals. So I'm going to start with the journal landscape, and then we're going to think about how to take your research and fit it into kind of the journal that's going to have the biggest impact for you. So I'm going to start by saying, and this is the part where I'm going to overlap a little bit with what Nada said, presented earlier today, that, you know, any political science journal can be described according to one of two dimensions. The first is its scope. So broad, is this a general interest journal that publishes research across all disciplinary subfields, or narrow? And so this would be a focus on a particular disciplinary subfield or a narrower topic of interest, like legislative politics, experimental methods, gender and politics. And for the purposes here, I'm going to argue that any interdisciplinary journal like Latin American Research Review is considered narrow because within the context of political science, it's only going to publish literature or research that's about Latin America. So that makes it a narrower journal, even though LAR technically is an interdisciplinary journal that will publish anthropologists and historians and political scientists. The second dimension is visibility, and I'm intentionally using visibility here instead of impact, because we as editors or authors have some ability to influence the visibility of our work because we can promote it. Journals can promote work of the authors they publish. Authors can promote their own work, and that's what makes it visible to others. So that ability to be discovered or for people to find your work and know about it is the first step to impact. Which is evidence of influence, that your paper had some sort of influence, but impact depends on other people actually taking up your ideas, engaging with them. So you have less control over your impact, but you do have more control over the visibility. And so I like to emphasize that distinction just so that you can understand what aspects of publishing you can have some influence over at the margins and what others that you have less control over. So visibility can be influenced by things like whether or not the journal or your particular paper is open access. And a number of journals, particularly the larger journals, are increasingly trying to publish more open access and have also special incentives or opportunities from scholars from countries like Brazil for publishing with lower or less expensive open access fees. You also can consider how or where a journal is indexed. So what databases is it included in? Does the journal have a stable publishing platform? Can people find your paper on once it's published? So those are all characteristics that contribute to increased visibility that are really something that the journal itself or the publisher can help enhance. Journals and publishers also increasingly engage in active promotion of the research itself with social media campaigns, special issues, having new articles once they're published be ungated or available open access for the first month. So for instance, most Cambridge University Press journals, which are a lot of the big kind of high visibility journals from the American Political Science Association, not just the APSR, but other smaller journals, they have a policy that every new article that comes out in one of their journals gets tweeted or posted on Twitter or X. And when that happens, that article is available for free to everyone for a month. So there are policies like that that really do enhance the visibility of your research. And so kind of paying attention to which journals are actively trying to promote the work that they publish and which aren't as active can make a big difference for the visibility. So that's just to explain why I want to kind of have two different emphases, one on visibility and one on impact. They are related though. And it's also important to note that visibility is not the same as scope. There are some journals that publish every field of political science. And so they have a wide, broad scope, they're general interest, but they're less visible. A great example of that would be the Canadian Journal of Political Science. Canada is a country with a population the size of California. And that journal publishes all fields of political science, but it doesn't have a lot of visibility. Many of you have probably never heard of it or even read it. So it's not the same as scope. So it's important to keep in mind as well. So what is the relationship between visibility and impact? Well, something has to be visible. People have to be aware of your work in order for them to engage with it. And so I think of impact as that act of engaging with public research. Measures of visibility tend to be things like how often an article is downloaded, how many times people visit that webpage for that journal, if articles are being tweeted, are there multiple impressions or engagement with that information online? Let me make this big again. Sorry, I have to do this every time to make the fonts bigger. Impact, though, reflects others' active engagement with the research. And so here we're thinking mostly about something called altmetrics, which refers to whether or not social or news media organizations are mentioning or engaging with published research. And this has become increasingly important in the last, I would say, decade or so. And then usually when we talk about impact, traditionally we focus on scholarly citations, right? Our other researchers taking up your ideas, engaging your ideas, and incorporating them into their own work going forward. So one of the challenges is that we have more control or influence over visibility, but what we really care about is impact. And ultimately what we really try to measure is impact. And I just want to emphasize in the next couple of slides that there is a relationship between these types of alt metrics and impact on social media or in the news, and more scholarly citations later on. So I'm going to walk you through, I'm going to sell you this argument to get you to believe that this is true. The first thing that we can do is we can look at the relationship and just the rankings or ratings or the journal impact factor of journals that do and don't have Twitter accounts. So this is kind of based on some data that I was able to pull together. These are for the kind of 300 plus, no, I take that back, 150 or so journals that are indexed in the Social Science Citation Index, which is one of these services that indexes different journals and then calculates a metric to say how kind of much impact or how important the research in that journal is. And so the journal impact factor basically is kind of easily read as the average number of citations for articles published in the last 2 years in that journal. And so what I'm trying to show you here is that there is a difference between the average impact factor of journals with and without a Twitter account. Now, of course, it could be endogenous. It could go the opposite direction. It could be that more high impact journals are more likely to get and open up a Twitter account, but I'm going to argue that actually it's probably the opposite. And what I think to me is interesting here is that you can see that in this figure, the orange are journals without Twitter and blue are the journals that have Twitter. And you can see that in the top quartile, in the third quartile of journals, the journals that have higher median impact factors are the ones that tend to have a Twitter handle. And interestingly, there's something going on in this mid-range of journals, kind of the second quartile, where their average citations or their average journal impact factor are the same. But this is just the first piece of evidence I'm giving you to suggest that there is some sort of important relationship between kind of visibility measured in this instance through Twitter, Twitter handles of the journal and kind of traditional measures of scholarly impact like the journal impact factor. And these differences are statistically significant. I'm going to just let you look at that for a second, make sure we're good. Now, as I mentioned, my audio started to do some. Hold on. Let's see, did that work? Good. It seems to reset if I turn off my microphone. So as I mentioned, this is a correlation. It's not causal. Maybe there's reverse causality. I'm going to now take our example of the APSR. So our team took over the APSR in 2020. The APSR did not have a Facebook or a Twitter or any social media. And one of the things that we proposed to do and did do was create social media accounts for the journal. And then we tweeted every article that came out. We also did highlights with particular authors about their articles. So we had a pretty active social media campaign. We also had like Throwback Thursday, where Celeste Montoya, who was our editor who handled social media, would actually tweet about an older article to get it more attention. And so these figures here are actually figures that I created for our annual editorial report. And the black line is APSR. The other lines are other kind of top journals in the discipline. And the thing I want you to kind of see is that you can tell after 2020 that not only does kind of the APSR have a bump in its traditional methods of ranking journals, the journal impact factor, and this other one, which I'm not going to talk a lot about, but it's called the normalized eigenfactor. And it's one of these that kind of like adjusts for how many journals are in the list and is meant to be more representative over time and across fields. But in both instances, the journal went from kind of being ranked 6th, for instance, to being ranked 3rd, or being ranked 3rd to being ranked 1st. Now, does that mean that we were publishing research that was that much better than, had been published just 4 years ago? That might be true, but I actually don't think that's true. I think a large part of what was going on was that we were actually promoting our research that we were publishing in the journal and making it more visible. And so just posting and tagging authors made it possible for other people in their network or those authors to also kind of retweet or repost the original tweet. And we believe that that helps explain why there was this translation of kind of social media influence to actual real citations in the scholarly literature influence. And I'll give you one more example. This comes from a paper that I co-authored with Thomas Vargas and Sarah Mitchell. And we actually showed that we had some data that we collected in 2017 on the number of tweets an article had received as of 2017, and also their altmetric score, which is kind of a mix of tweets and newspaper references and blog posts and Facebook and, a bunch of other types of online activity. But we found, we collected some data in 2017 about how visible research was online in 2017. And then we collected additional data in 2021, so 5 years later, to see whether or not those articles had higher citations in the traditional sense, higher impact. And we found that, in fact, they did. The figures are too small to see, but basically what they're trying to show you is that this is for our analysis of altmetric scores, and basically across the board for every type of author, whether you're a woman writing alone, a man writing alone, or if you're in a team of authors, if you have a higher altmetric score in 2017, you're going to have significantly higher citations in the scholarly literature 5 years later. And this was for a journal, a sample of about 21 political science journals. And then we repeated that same analysis, focusing on tweets and the number of tweets articles had in 2017. And we find the same pattern, that articles that are tweeted more or have more tweets, then later on, controlling for what journal they're in and whether or not it's a general or a special journal and those types of characteristics, those articles have more traditional citations later. One of the reasons that we included gender of the authors in this analysis is because there is some research that suggests that social media use by political scientists is gendered, that like men and women who are political scientists, they tweet different things, or they tweet about different things, including their research differently. So we wanted to investigate that. So just to kind of summarize this part that, again, overlaps in a lot of ways with what Nada told you this morning, you can think about political science journals in terms of their scope and their visibility and their impact. But then you have to figure out, well, how do you kind of fit these all together to identify which journal is going to make the most sense for you? So to do that, I'm going to kind of walk through a couple of these examples in more detail and then give you a 2x2 table to try to locate where to put your work. So for instance, if we think about journals with broad scope or general interest journals, here I have on the right-hand side in this plot, various journals. And so these are the median citation counts for articles published in those journals since 2019. And I collected this data like 3 weeks ago. So this is ordered by in descending order, so the highest number of citations to the lowest. So I'm going to say that, according to this figure and this metric, that, the first 4 journals on this list have higher visibility than the ones at the bottom of the list, right? So high visibility journals tend to have a certain set of characteristics. High visibility general interest journals have a certain set of characteristics. So for instance, the APSR is quite old. It's been around for over a century. It's considered the flagship journal of the American Political Science Association. It does publish research across any field of political science. And importantly, the editors change every 4 years. And so what that means is that we're constantly, as a discipline, getting new leadership to bring new ideas and new foci to the leadership of the journal. That also means that different editorial teams can have radically different turnaround times and preferences in terms of what they want to publish. So I want to also acknowledge that that's important to recognize and keep in mind. But then we also have journals that have broad scope, but are maybe lower visibility. And so we could think about the Canadian Journal of Political Science or the Brazilian Political Science Review as examples of that. Both journals will publish any subfield of political science, but they have lower international visibility, but may have high local visibility, right? So you may choose actually that for some of your work, you want to publish it in a Brazilian journal, or I might want to publish in a Canadian journal because I want to talk specifically to Canadian political scientists and have the biggest impact there. And in the case of the Canadian Journal of Political Science, it is also the flagship research journal of the National Political Science Association, and it also has a team that changes every few years. And so their turnaround times and their priorities are also going to change. So that's kind of the broad scope journals. We also then have journals that are narrower in scope or have a subfield focus or a special interest journal. So same thing here. I just grabbed kind of somewhat random. I mean, I picked some that so I would have some that have higher median citations and some with lower median citations. But you'll see that many of these are the same ones that Nada mentioned earlier today, right? And again, they're sorted. So international organization and world politics tend to be international relations, comparative politics, kind of at the intersection of those. And, this is the distribution of their citations. And they do have some articles that are very, very highly cited within a handful of years. So they have much more visibility and impact. And then you have some that like politics, groups, and identities, or these more Latin American focused ones that tend to have fewer citations and be lower visibility. Right? So what do we do with this? What do we do with this information? Well, that gets us some part of the way there, right? That we have this idea that there's like broad or narrow and high and low visibility. And we can think about our work and who we want to reach and what we want to publish by trying to kind of decide whether or not we want to go broad or narrow, or whether our research speaks to a broad audience or it can be framed in that way, or whether it's more narrow and harder to frame as being of broad interest. But the problem with this, or the limitation here, is you're always going to want to pick, almost always, not always, but almost always, you're going to want to pick the high visibility, right? Like, why would you pick these low visibility ones when you could publish in the high visibility ones? Well, part of the answer to that might be that this is only part of the story. You also still have to take into account the informal norms and criteria that these journals use in terms of the peer review process and what types of work they publish. So I'm going to start by saying that when you're trying to think about your paper, and I'm assuming that, you're graduate students, you're working on a thesis, so you might have multiple papers, or you might have multiple papers that can come out of your thesis, and not all of them are necessarily going to be of broad interest. Some might be suitable for you to reframe or to package as if or for a broader audience, and others might just be really too narrow and too focused on something that is of really interest only in Brazil, or maybe it's only of interest to people who do public opinion work or people who study gender. So I'm going to argue that the first thing that you want to do is ask whether or not the paper addresses a research question of broad interest. Does it span more than one field of political science? Is it working at the intersection of two fields? Does it address a long-standing central theoretical concern of a field? So what would that be? That would be something like democratization in comparative politics. That's kind of a long-standing, central, important question for the field of comparative politics. The other thing is, alternatively, maybe it addresses a timely theoretical, substantive, or methodological issue. So what I'm thinking of here is questions of polarization, populism. Those are all considered timely. They're things that political scientists 15 years ago weren't writing about, but now are talking a lot about. And so if you can say genuinely, like in your heart of hearts, that your paper is answering, is doing one of these things. It's talking to more than one subfield. It's looking at something that's kind of central and a long-standing concern, or it's something really kind of new and timely, then maybe you can frame that paper for a broad interest journal. But here's where it gets trickier. The other thing you want to think about is whether or not the paper's contribution is novel or innovative. And this is difficult in part because many of us want our work to be novel or innovative, or we think that it's novel or innovative, but it's not always novel or innovative in the way that the broader discipline and editors and reviewers are going to think that it's novel or innovative. So particularly at the high visibility general interest journals, and I think Nada also talked about this morning, talked about the importance of a novel or innovative theoretical argument. So I can tell you at the APSR, we got a lot of papers that were really well executed, used really fancy methodologies, used really good data, but when it came down to it, the paper was essentially testing an argument that we already knew had a lot of evidence to support it, right? So it would be someone who takes an argument that was developed in the US using US public opinion, and then they run a survey experiment in Spain and show us that, yes, it also works in Spain, but without any type of innovation in the method or theory. And in those instances, what reviewers would often say is like, this is well done, it's high quality, but it's not innovative. It doesn't have a novel theoretical component. I just want to draw attention here to the fact that in the global north, in political science, there's a real strong emphasis on causal explanations and why questions, as opposed to just describing a case or describing an event. And a lot of the papers from the global south that would be desk rejected at the APSR, ultimately for a lot of them, it was for this reason, that they just kind of described something that happened, but they didn't have a causal explanation. Another way that a paper can be novel is by developing or applying a novel or innovative methodology. And this is really hard also because methods move really fast. Something that seemed like a novel text analysis method 5 years ago now might seem very kind of traditional and well-trodden and not as innovative as it once was. And then the third part is, does your paper use novel or innovative evidence? Are you using new data sets? Did you collect original data? Are you using, if you do qualitative work, are you using cases that have not been studied before? Now, there is kind of some old folklore type advice out there that I've heard attributed to Jan Bok-Steffensmeier, but I'm sure other political scientists have said this, that in order to get published in the APSR or the HAPS or the JOP, you have to have 2 out of 3 of these. You have to be novel on 2 out of 3 dimensions. That's really hard. That is very, very difficult. Do I think that's true? Not always. I think there are some papers that get published that are only novel on 1 dimension. I think sometimes papers get published in the APSR that aren't novel on any of these dimensions. But needless to say, there is kind of this folk wisdom out there that reviewers, even if editors disagree with it, that reviewers will be using as a shorthand for, is this paper novel enough for a top journal in political science? Another way that I've heard my editors, my colleagues as editors talk about this is they ask, how is this paper going to change the way we study or understand whatever the topic is, right? So it has to kind of make us think about things differently, have new insights, have different insights. It needs to somehow challenge the status quo through its novelty and innovation. So that's really hard too. So one of the things that we haven't, I think, talked about yet today is about how long your paper is going to be, because that's one of the kind of formal rules that most journals have, a word count limit. And at the APSR, it's 12,000 words. At other journals, it'll be 8,000 words. And so that can make a difference. And it can make a difference in part because depending on the nature of your argument in your research, you may need more or less space. So generally, you want your papers to be shorter rather than longer. But if you're kind of trying to speak to 2 different literatures or 2 different debates and 2 different subfields with your one study, you're going to need more space, right? You're going to have to develop that. So if you're really broad, if you're making a really broad argument, one way that you'll know that is that you have to kind of develop your argument in light of more than one literature, more than one sets of debates. And so you're going to need more space. Also, novelty often requires more explanation. If you're using a new data set, you have to spend more time explaining how it was collected. If you're using a new methodology, you're going to have to spend more time explaining the method. So novelty often requires more explanation. So if you're trying to kind of get that 2 out of 3 and you're trying to kind of have a novel argument and be broad, that's probably going to take more space. You're going to have to do some work to convince the readers that your argument is novel and that it's of broad interest. And so you're going to need to write a longer paper. At the same time, a lot of journals recently have started adding shorter research letters or notes. So these are usually anywhere from 3,000 to 4,000 words. So they're about approximately half the length of an article or a longer form submission at those journals. And often the expectations are different for these shorter papers, even in the same journal. And some journals will explicitly on their website say how the shorter version of an article is different or what they're looking for. But in general, I think reviewers understand that if you're going to present an argument and some evidence in a shorter format, then you're going to have to pull back and not do certain things with as much depth. In practice, based on my experience at the APSR, we end up with we end up with this kind of intersection. So I'm going to walk you through each cell of this because we've already kind of covered all the definitions, but I want to give you a sense of like how you would think about this strategically for your papers. So if you have a project that you're working on and you have developed a novel theoretical argument and you have collected your own original evidence, so you have high novelty, right? Because you've got new theory, new evidence, that's 2 out of the 3, you're doing good so far. Now, the question is, can you make it, or is it of broad interest? Is it addressing a timely question? Is it addressing a timeless question, an old question that's really important? Or is it addressing a question that's of interest to a lot of different people? Maybe American politics is interested and Brazilian politics or comparative politics. If that's the case, then maybe that project is a good candidate for a high visibility general interest journal article, like the APSR, AJPS, for a full length article, right? Why? Because you're going to need all that space in order to convince people that you have high novelty and that it's of broad interest. Now, what if you have something that is high novelty, but it's pretty narrow, right? You're not convinced that you can sell it as being of broad interest because it feels a little bit specialized. Like only people who are interested in, I don't know, the politics of same-sex marriage are going to be interested in this. I take that because that's something I work on myself, and it's fairly narrow. If that's the case, but you still have high novelty, you have kind of new insights, new data, something that's different or fresh about it, you might actually be able to place that in a high visibility general interest journal as a research note instead of an article. Why is that? Well, that's partly because the remit for a note is going to be smaller. And so there's not necessarily going to be this expectation that you convince us that it's of broad interest. So you don't need all that space to develop a literature review and an argument that kind of connects it to all these different literatures. Instead, you can, in a high visibility general interest journal, have this shorter format that is still novel and speaks to perhaps a narrow interest, but is kind of high quality and novel and of interest and meet the remit or the expectations of that journal with a shorter note. The other option for that same type of project would be a high visibility field journal article if you need the space. Let's say, for instance, you're like, I can't fit it into 3,000 words. I've just got too much, but you do have high novelty, but it's narrow. Then maybe that's when you shoot for comparative political studies or another international studies quarterly or IO or world politics. You then kind of are targeting a journal that has a narrower focus, but is still highly visible for your research. So I'll let you think about that for a second, those trade-offs. But not all of our work is novel, right? Not all of it has new data, new methods, new theory. You might still be able to get your work, even if it's not that novel, into a high visibility general interest journal as a note if it is of broad interest, right? So maybe you have a very specific point to make. You're using perhaps existing data sets, but you've got a new argument that you are able to develop and are able to illustrate with this data set. And that argument you think you can frame as being of broad interest, then you might be able to package that as a note, a research note or a letter, a shorter format, and submit it to a high visibility general interest journal. And then the fallback would be a low visibility general interest journal article if it's of broad interest. right? So this would be the lower ranked journals that publish in every field. Political Research Quarterly, for instance, would be a good option. And then down here in the bottom right corner is kind of where you don't necessarily have new data, or your argument is testing an argument developed elsewhere, but on kind of data that you have gotten access to through a public data sharing, something like that. There, you might, and it's of narrow interest, there you might consider kind of either a high visibility field journal as a research note. So some of these journals like Political Analysis, the Methods Journal, they have research notes. So if you have a methodological point to make and can make it quickly and in an abbreviated form, that might be a good option. Or kind of the fallback position for most of us would be kind of a low visibility, narrow interest field journal, right? So there's kind of a hierarchy here, but the thing that I'm trying to get you to think about is this informal criteria that journal editors and peer reviewers have about novelty, and how to map that on to kind of the length of articles or research notes and the formats that you can submit to the journals. So I feel like I should stop for a second to see if there are any questions, because this is kind of a complicated idea. Or comments, Lorena or Nada or Rebecca, if someone wants to comment on. Yeah. I think Lorena wants to say something.
Okay.
No, I was just gonna,
Go ahead, Lorena.
Nada,
Yeah.
just a quick comment because we're working a lot with a lot of Brazilian specific papers. Like you said in your comments a lot, I think one big challenge for a lot of political scientists in Brazil is the visibility issue with if my case study is mostly only about Brazil. And if you can be a little bit more, if you can go a little bit further in that challenge, because I think that's a really hard identifying visibility, high visibility when I work on, or when my paper is really focused on a specific case study.
Yeah, I think then it is, what is it about your study of Brazil that speaks to broader debates? And can you find a way to think about your research as bringing the Brazilian case to debates maybe that are happening outside of Brazil and are happening in the broader political science realm? And I agree, it is really a challenge. As a young scholar, my primary area of focus was Mexico. And I chose Mexico because, my advisors were like, you want to pick a big case. You want to pick a big country because you're more likely to get published than if you study the Dominican Republic, for instance. And so on the one hand, you're lucky because Brazil is a big case. It's an important case. But you still face that challenge of making it broad interest. And in my own case, I had a paper that was about Mexican welfare policy that I submitted to AJPS. And I can tell you it took much longer than it should have to go through review. This was in the early 2000s. And I got the reviews back, and the reviews basically were minor questions about my data or whatever. I could literally fix all the things in the reviews in under a day. But the editor at the time, who was an American, who did American politics, said this is not of sufficiently broad interest for the AJPS. And that's classic. That is so classic. And I think part of it is I didn't do this in the case of Mexico, and in the case of that paper. And what you have to do is you have to think about why should people that study Poland or the UK or the United States or Brazil, or Mexico or Chile or some other country be interested in my case study of Brazil? What is it about my insights that tell us something new about theory, and give us new theoretical insights that we didn't have before, that cause us to stop and reflect on the big debates and realize that maybe those theories aren't as generalizable as we previously thought. But you have to be adding something that's not just, here's more information to show how this works in Brazil. It has to be something more along the lines of, what do we learn about politics that we didn't know about before because you've brought us this case that happens to be in Brazil? There are probably other ways to answer that, but that would be my general. And I think I have a couple of other points that kind of speak to this as well coming up.
Oui. Yeah, can you hear me? Is the microphone?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to add to that because I think the system is biased against us in that sense. I feel that people that are publishing in the US and that scholars that focus on the US, they don't have to sell their case that much. It's almost like obvious that it's relevant just because it comes from the US. And so I've been doing work on misinformation for like 5 years. And not a single paper that was published in the US has like to, sell the case so well because, it's so obvious that, it's important to study misinformation. But me and my co-authors, we got that question from the review that we went through at the JOP. It was like, why is Brazil important? And we were just like, nobody had to answer that question, when they were producing work in the US. But we Brazilians obviously have to sell our case much more. So I think, it's nice also to understand that the system is kind of biased against scholars from outside the US, right? And so to practice our we have to really practice this, right, of trying to sell our case better. And I think, Michelle, the suggestions you gave were so relevant, and I really like the way you organized the tips and the ways of like thinking about the review process. Really great. Other questions?
I do have more slides on other stuff about the APSR and things, but I wanted to stop here just because this is kind of a complicated core idea.
Fala em português que eu tento traduzir. I think I can answer that. It's so it's 2 out of 3. So she gave 3 criteria, right? And she said that for publishing at one of these top journals, you have to meet at least 2 out of these 3, which are those there. Sorry, Michelle, I answered that for you, but you can go ahead.
No, that's good. That's good. Yeah. And I don't think that that's always true, but it is kind of a rule of thumb that circulates among Americans about how to get published in these journals is you have to have novelty, and it has to be on more than one of these dimensions here.
Yeah. Então precisa ser em mais de uma dimensão. Preencher só um critério não seria suficiente para se enquadrar no escopo desses general journals.
Yeah.
Other questions so far? No? Okay, I think you can go ahead, Michelle.
Great. I'm going to now talk about insights from the APSR itself. So this is kind of a high visibility, high impact, general interest journal. I want to say that, the editors matter, like who is editing the journal does make a difference. But often reviewers have more specialized expertise that are closer to a paper's topic or method than the editors. And so in these general interest journals, even when you have a team, the new editorial team for the APSR has 16 editors, 16. Not many of them work on Latin America, right? So what that means is that those editors are gonna rely more heavily on their reviewers for these questions of novelty and interest if they don't have that particular expertise. And it turns out in general interest, high visibility journals, peer reviewers, the reviewers themselves, really prioritize novelty. So most of what I've said before comes from my experiences as an APSR co-editor. And I'm going to now kind of give you some additional information about that and some tips and tricks. So this figure illustrates the, at the APSR, we don't have information on the location of all authors. We just have the corresponding author. So the corresponding author is the person who does the upload to the journal and who is kind of the official person in charge of navigating the journal process for that paper. And sometimes it's the lead author or the first author, but it doesn't have to be. But this is just the author that handles the submission on behalf of the paper itself. And so we only at the APSR have information on the location of residence of the corresponding author. And this is what it looks like. This is for the last 8 years. So I used the data from the APSR database and went back 8 years and said, oh, in the last 8 years, how many times has a corresponding author come from one of these countries? And you can see that it's not evenly distributed at all. So there were 88 different countries. Clearly, very few submissions or many fewer submissions led by a scholar from the Global South. Only 35 submissions in that 8 years had a corresponding author from Brazil. That's less than 3% of all submissions, because the APSR gets about 1,500 submissions a year. So this is just to kind of say Brazilian scholars are not submitting to the APSR. At the same time, I can tell you that certain folks from certain types of institutions, like say the Harvards, Princetons, Yales, those types of places, they're submitting every paper to the APSR. Now, I don't think that's right either, because not every one of their papers belongs in the APSR, but that doesn't stop them from submitting. So I don't know if in Brazil there's a joke about lottery tickets, but you can't win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket, right? You can't get your work published in the APSR if you don't submit to the APSR. So that's the first step, is you have to actually try to submit to the APSR. And many Brazilian scholars are not. Now, desk rejects. You heard a little bit about this earlier today. This is, again, going to be from the APSR for the last 8 years. So it includes our team and the previous team. And the blue line here is the overall desk reject rate. So this is the percentage of papers that are rejected by the editors before they even get a chance to get in front of reviewers. And so you'll see that the APSR desk reject rate is, 40, 45, 44%. And it's lower if you're from the US or Canada. In this coding I used the World Bank. I used a package to kind of take all the countries and put them into World Bank categories. So in this instance, Mexico counts as Latin America, not North America. So basically, every other region of the world has a higher desk reject rate than North American scholars. Even European and Central Asian scholars have a higher desk reject rate. What does that mean? That's really about whether or not those authors understand these norms and expectations about what it means to submit and publish in the journal. So what types of papers get desk rejected? One of the things as editors that we think about is kind of, is this paper likely to survive peer review? Because we don't want to spend a lot of time sending a paper out for review if we don't think the reviewers are going to like it or think that it's good enough. So, we want it to be well-written, clear, and complete. If it's an empirical paper, is the argument causal? Now, it doesn't mean you have to use methods of causal inference. Some reviewers are pretty hardcore causal inference folks, but most editors are more pluralistic than that and don't have strong expectations around causal inference. But you do have to have a why question, right? It does need to make a causal argument. Is the paper novel in some way? Do we think as editors that reviewers will think it's novel? Does it make us go, oh, this is new. I've never seen anything like this, or this is making me think about populism in a different way. This is making me think about the politics of trade agreements in a different way than what I've seen before. And then this is for y'all as folks who work on Brazil. If you do work on Brazil, this is the important thing. This is where a lot of comparative papers fall down at the desk review stage. And I've heard so many times my editors, my co-editors who work on comparative politics and handle comparative politics manuscripts complain about the scope conditions of the argument. What are the scope conditions of the argument? Does the argument only apply to Brazil? Or could it apply somewhere else? And why? And where else besides Brazil does it apply to? What other places? Is it only other developing countries? Is it only other developing countries of a certain size? Do they have to be democratic, or do they have to have a certain type of democracy? Those types of scope conditions need to be really clearly laid out somewhere in the paper. That not only do I have this argument about Brazil, I don't think it applies just to Brazil. I think my argument would also apply to all of these other countries and give us some definitions about what those countries look like. You don't have to name them, but you have to be able to say it's all other democracies that are, young democracies, fragile democracies. It's all other middle income countries with certain characteristics. And then the other question that my comparative co-editors would often ask is, are the findings generalizable? They might be just about Brazil or China or Mexico, but would they travel? Do we think that they would be generalizable to other places? Do the authors explain why they would be generalizable? And so at the desk reject stage for papers on specific countries, this is kind of the biggest problem, the most common issue that the comparative editors would identify. And we're identifying that as a problem because we know that the reviewers are going to view that as a problem, right? In some instances, some papers that we receive that are submitted as articles, we have to say something along the lines of, this is not going to make it as an article, but maybe it would work as a note, a research note, or a letter, a shorter paper. Why? Well, in some instances, it's interesting and novel or timely, but it has novel data and it's on a timely topic, but the theory isn't that novel. The argument isn't that novel. It's just showing us, for instance, that an existing argument also applies to this new case that we didn't know about. So there were a number of times that we, as editors, would get a paper and would desk reject it as an article and say, no, this isn't going to kind of pass review as an article, but it might work really well as a letter. And so in most instances, if that were the case, the editors themselves would indicate as much. It didn't happen very often, but a handful of times we would say, we're rejecting this as an article, but we invite you to resubmit it as a letter, because we think you could, if you pared it down to just 3,000, 4,000 words in your core claims, we think that it could fit the journal in that way. So this is something to think of if you get, if you submit a paper to APSR, AJPS, one of the big high visibility journals, and they tell you, oh, this is interesting and it's really well done, it's just not novel enough for our audience, that might be a sign that, well, maybe it would be something that they would consider publishing, or another high interest, broad interest journal would consider publishing as a short note, a research note, or a letter. Right, if it's got some core thing that's interesting, but it's kind of doesn't need the full length. Overall, at the APSR, the final acceptance rates are low, and we increased them. So this is over the last 8 years, taking into account kind of all the submissions. And basically, only 7% of all the articles or letters or notes or whatever format that are submitted to the APSR end up getting published. It used to be closer to 5, and we've pushed it up to 7. The new team that took over in June, they have said that they want to publish 50% more articles. If they are successful, the only way they're going to achieve that is by increasing this acceptance rate. Right? So maybe now's a good time to submit to the APSR. I would actually give them a couple months. They just started and they're a little bit fresh. I would wait until like November. Give them till November and then submit your paper. So they kind of have their routines in place and things like that. But they did, I'm not telling you anything secret, they did say publicly that they wanted to publish 50% more papers. And the only way they're going to be able to do that, because we already kind of expanded the range of topics and relaxed some of the criteria. So we published more work on race, more work on gender. The only way that they're going to be able to achieve that is if they move this acceptance rate. But even still, they're only going to move it probably to 10%. So that's 1 out of every 10 papers. That's still really hard to get published. And you'll see we published in 8 years, the journal published 0 papers where the corresponding author was from South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa as their affiliation. Now that's their, like, you know, they might have kind of been born and raised there and then they went to Harvard and now they're at Harvard or something. But people who have affiliations in those regions, we didn't publish in 8 years. We did not publish a single paper by someone from those regions. But you can see that Latin Americans are doing a little bit better, right? They're still below the overall acceptance rate, but they're doing better. And what this says to me is that if you can get past the desk reject, most Latin American scholars kind of understand the process and can navigate it and understand the norms enough that you can have a good chance of getting accepted if you can get past the desk reject. So if you do get an invitation to revise and resubmit, the editors want to publish your paper. Assuming everything pans out and there's no kind of hidden secrets in your data or your results that you kind of tried to hide in the first submission. If an editor or an editorial team is giving you an invitation to revise and resubmit, they're on your side, right? Things can still go wrong, but for the most part, they want to publish your paper. Generally, you need to address kind of all reasonable reviewer requests, but sometimes it makes sense to say no. When does it make sense to say no? When you feel like you have a strong theoretical or methodological reason for doing something the way that you did, right? It's okay to kind of lay that out and lay out an argument for why you think the way that you set up your framing or your theory or your method is correct. Of course, that's easier to do if you've got 2 reviewers that are saying, this is amazing, just the way it is, and it's only one reviewer that's really kind of quibbling about something. But generally, as long as you kind of address all of the concerns if you've gotten an R&R, the editor is hoping to publish your paper because they've already invested in your paper. So I know that this might, on the one hand, seem discouraging because the desk reject rate is higher than average and the final acceptance rate is lower than average. But I actually see cause for kind of optimism here, that if you can get your paper under review, reviewers are probably going to be, you know, almost as likely to give you another chance to R&R. So now I'm going to get to some, I'm trying to move my Zoom around, some tips and things. And all of these, almost all of them come from either the 20 years I've spent sending papers to journals and getting them rejected, or the last 4 years as an editor. So they're not really my personal opinions as much as my personal observations based on my experiences. So the first thing that seems obvious, but so few people do this, I think, especially if you're young, you're kind of nervous, you don't want to show your paper to other folks, you're afraid of what they'll tell you, but I think it's really important to make sure that someone else reads the paper before you submit. And these are some questions that you want to ask them to report back to you to make sure that your paper says what you think it says. Right? Because you might think your paper says one thing, but someone else reads it and they read it as saying something different. So you want to ask them to tell you, what do you think the takeaway message is? Right? And if they start by saying, well, I think this is a paper about Brazil, blah, 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 and you want to publish it in a general interest journal, then that's a problem, right? Because you want them to be saying, I think this is a paper about populism. I think this is a paper about disinformation, right? So ask someone else to read it and say, what do you think is the takeaway message? And they should ideally come away from it saying, oh, this is a paper about this bigger phenomena, this important debate, this important political movement, this important political event that is unfolding. Ask them if it seems novel, because you might think it's novel, you might think it's new, but maybe they're like, yeah, I saw a paper that was similar to this once, or maybe it doesn't seem as new to them. Are the findings complete and clear? Are you explaining everything well? Another big challenge with papers are papers that don't explain the methods. They don't explain the data collection, the data analysis process clearly enough. So make sure it's clear. Ask them who they think you're talking to. Ask them if they think you're talking to other Brazilian scholars or to political scientists that are interested in environmental politics in general instead. You know, ask them, is it ready? A lot of journals will allow you to suggest reviewers. So this is where in the interface you can say, you know, who you would recommend be a reviewer for this. There's a lot of conflicting advice and debate about this. I would say that it's helpful and useful to suggest reviewers with a couple of caveats or warnings. Do not be unethical. Do not suggest reviewers with real or perceived conflicts of interest. Don't put your advisors, your co-authors, other people from your department, your friends, people who have already read the paper. Why? Because if they get invited to read the paper and then say, no, I can't read this paper because I already read it before and gave John feedback, then that will not look good to the editors. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to necessarily reject your paper out of hand, but it will, it's not a good look. It's not appropriate. The other thing is you don't want to only suggest big names in the field, right? There's one person, I'm not going to say her name. I will say it's a her. There's one person who is a very, very big name in comparative politics at a very, very prestigious institution who has never, ever reviewed for the APSR. Always declines or doesn't even answer our emails. So I would not only suggest big names because we can't have Gary King read every methods paper, right? We have to have a range of people to read papers. And the big names or the famous people, not only might they be too busy, they might not actually be the best fit, right? And so I would actually recommend not suggesting the most famous political scientist who wrote a paper 30 years ago on your topic, but I would instead think of people a little bit more advanced than you, assistant professors, newly tenured associate professors, right? Why? Because they're more likely to say yes if they're invited, and they're also probably actually closer to the work that you're doing if you're familiar with their work, right? If you're familiar with their work, then even though they're not the big name and the famous person, they must be really close to what you do. I would also say you don't want to suggest too many names. I would say 2 or 3 suggestions is useful, but if you do too many, then basically you've included everyone that's possible, and some editors don't want to invite suggested reviewers. So that brings me to this next point, that editors may or may not use the names. The reason they're useful, though, is they help editors know this is the type of scholar that this person thinks would fit their paper well. So sometimes at the APSR, we would invite one suggested reviewer. But more importantly, we could look at that list of suggested reviewers and then see who they co-author with, what other people they're citing. And so it helps the editor have a better idea of this is the type of scholar we should be inviting to review this paper from the perspective of the author. And so that's why they're useful. And that's why it's useful to, just give 1 or 2, 2 or 3, just a couple, to help the editor think about how you think about your paper and who should be reading it. And keep in mind that editors will need a mix of expertise. So I know at the APSR, we would often try to get someone who knew about that country, someone who knew about that theory, and someone who knew about that method, for instance. And sometimes it's not possible to get one person that knows all 3 dimensions of a paper. Or if there is a person like that, maybe you already know them, right? Maybe they're your advisor, and so they're not eligible because of a conflict of interest. But keeping in mind that editors are going to be looking for people that are experts on multiple different dimensions means that sometimes you'll get reviews back from someone who says, I don't know anything about formal theory, but I know all about corruption in Brazil, and that's the perspective of my review. And then usually the editors will have someone else who maybe knows about corruption and formal theory, but maybe doesn't know so much about Brazil, and they'll focus on the formal parts of the paper and the theoretical argument about corruption, but they'll say, I don't really know about the application to Brazil, for instance. I also have some specific suggestions for quantitative papers. At the American Political Science Review, about 60% of all of our submissions included quantitative evidence. I think that's probably also true for JOP, AJPS, many of the kind of top political science journals. And so these tips are based on my experience handling quantitative papers at the journal. I would say in the main paper itself, lead with what you believe is the best analytic approach. Even if you tried many different specifications, or if you have a bunch of different options that you threw away, we don't need to see all of those. You want to emphasize in the main paper the results and the finding that gives you the most stars, right? That's not it. It's the one that you think is the most appropriate for your research question and the data that you have. And then if you have robustness analyses or you have additional extensions that show that, oh, if I change it from random effects to fixed effects, I get the same results, those are fine. They can go in an appendix, but still you don't want to give us everything, right? Why? Because a reviewer is going to go through that. Some reviewers will go through all of that and they will go, aha, in version 10, it's not significant. And we don't need all of that, right? So you want to have a motivation, you want to have a reason for doing the other specifications. So just to summarize, you want to, in the main paper, present the version of the results that you think are the most appropriate and the best. And then if you have a good reason for trying a different version of the model or a different type of analysis with your data, then you can put that in the appendix. But we don't need to see every different version that's possible because that's overwhelming. And appendices can be 80 pages long. They can be longer than the paper. And I can tell you from experience that it's really hard to get reviewers to review papers that have 90-page appendices. And if they do review it, it's going to take them twice as long because every time they sit down to do it and open it up, they look at the 90-page appendix and go, make sure your results are complete. So there's a trend these days to present findings using figures or abbreviated tables where you don't include all the control variables or you only plot marginal effects or predicted effects. And that's fine. However, in my experience, that can be very, very frustrating for reviewers and editors if they can't figure out exactly what you did. If they can't figure out what control variables you included, or they can't figure out from the narrative what specification you used or what estimation procedure you used. So what we did when we ran the journal was we asked authors to provide full tables in an appendix to back up any abbreviated table or figure that was in the main paper. And that was mainly just so reviewers could go kind of look at it and see and understand what was going on, because we discovered after about a year that too many reviewers would say reject and recommend reject just because they couldn't tell. They would say, I don't know what's going on here. And then they would say reject, right? They won't give you the benefit of the doubt. The other thing to remember is to not just talk about whether or not your findings are statistically significant, but talk about the size or the substance of your findings. So put coefficient sizes in context. Give us some real world interpretations of the sizes of your treatment effects or your model effects. And then you should also just always be using scripts for your data cleaning and analysis. Because many journals will ask you to deposit these and make them public, and you don't want to have to go back and recreate them after your paper has been conditionally accepted and then write an awkward email to the editors that says, oh, I was going back through to create these scripts to reproduce my work after the fact, and it turns out my results are not the same, because that happens and that's not good. So you should always be using scripts. Pre-registration of your pre-analysis plan. So this is an emerging norm that I want to mention just because as you're junior and you're just getting started, and maybe you're already ready to publish, or maybe you're a couple years out and you're just thinking about these things. I would say that if you haven't collected your data yet or done your analysis, especially if you're doing something with experiments, I would strongly encourage you to consider pre-registration and a pre-analysis plan, because more and more journals are asking authors to, or expecting authors to have their analyses pre-registered. So I've included here a couple of links or papers that kind of talk about this, the pros and cons of pre-registration, And this last one by Ofosu and Posner talks a little bit about the ways in which pre-registration and pre-analysis plans in the early days were kind of not as good as they could have been. So it has some advice about what should be included in your pre-analysis plan going forward. But as I mentioned, some journals, like the Journal of Politics, as of 2021, requires any experimental work to have a pre-registered pre-analysis plan. Now, one important element and point of confusion that I encountered as an editor is that sometimes junior scholars think that their thesis proposal is a pre-analysis plan, or something that they gave their advisor as a pre-analysis plan. That is not. For our purposes, that does not count. It needs to be public. It needs to be binding. And so we've had instances where a paper would come in and it would say that it was pre-registered or that there was a pre-analysis plan. And so we would write back to the authors and say, would you please attach a copy of that? Because we want to give that to the reviewers to look at. And they would go, oh, yeah, no, it's not pre-registered after all. And that's not good. That's not good. So a couple of tips if you do pre-register your pre-analysis plan. And I haven't talked a lot about what a pre-analysis plan is. I kind of assumed that you would know. It's basically a document where you explain how you're going to collect your data and how you're going to analyze it. And you go put that on a website somewhere before you collect the data or before you analyze it. And the purpose is to minimize the chances that you walk barefoot through the data and try to find something significant after the fact. So if you do pre-register, a couple of tips. Don't use the same title for the pre-registration in the paper, because then reviewers can go Google it and find your pre-registration with your name on it. And you don't want that, right? Like maybe if you're at Harvard or at Stanford, you kind of accidentally want people to find your paper. But I'm guessing that if you're a Brazilian scholar, you probably don't want them to know that you're a Brazilian scholar until after it's published or accepted. So use a generic title for the pre-analysis plan and keep your good title for the paper that you're going to submit so that they can't be kind of connected. So make your pre-registration title be very vague. Do include your pre-analysis plan with your submission. That can take a number of forms. In some instances, depending on where you've pre-registered, you have to print kind of an anonymous PDF of the pre-registration and upload that as an attachment. In other instances, like the Open Science Foundation, one of the reasons I like that platform for pre-registration is that it has the option of giving you a link to an anonymous version of your pre-analysis plan. So it's very professional. It's very easy for reviewers to click on the link and they go to this website at OSF that has your pre-analysis plan that's all anonymized, and then they can verify that it's pre-registered in a public place, and it should be all complete and there for them to do their review. The other important thing, if you pre-register, is to make sure that you include reasoned justifications for any deviations from your pre-analysis plan. So some reviewers, not all reviewers, but some reviewers are very, very adamant that you do exactly what you said you were going to do in your pre-analysis plan. And sometimes they'll say, oh, I understand, as long as you explain why. I said I was going to code this variable 1 to 5, but then once I got the data, I realized it didn't actually look normal, so I needed to recode it this other way. As long as you have a reasoned justification for why you made that change, usually reviewers are okay with that. They might still ask you to go back and do it the original way also to show that you get the same results. But if you are going to deviate, don't try to pretend you didn't. Right? Don't try to like just kind of skip over it and hope no one notices. It's important to acknowledge that. As I mentioned, I really like the Open Science Foundation as a place to pre-register because of the facilities it has, the way it works. And then the other thing is to make sure that the PDFs that you upload to OSF are also anonymous. Because I've also had instances where it looked anonymous, but then when you opened up the PDF, it had someone's affiliation and name in the document itself. So you want to make sure that you plan ahead when you're submitting your pre-registration. Some other things that have been debated, whether or not you should promote your work prior to submission, right? Should you be on Twitter doing a long Twitter thread of your paper just before you submit it to the APSR? Probably not. Do people from Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Princeton, and all the Ivies do that? Yes. They do that because they're at those places and they want people to find their paper and know about their paper so that when it's reviewed, they get a halo effect and people will be like, oh, this is a paper from Harvard. But I'm guessing that y'all don't want to do that. The other thing is if you're presenting a paper at a journal, consider using at a conference, and it's going to appear in the conference program, consider using a different title for your submission from what you submitted at the conference. Now, if it gets accepted, you can always go change the title back to that cool title you had at the beginning. So like, let's say you had this really neat title at the conference presentation, and now you're submitting it to a journal. So you give it a kind of a more boring title. It gets accepted. Then you can go back to the really good title you had to start with if you want, right? But the main thing is you don't want to taint the reviewer pool. You don't want people who should be reviewing your paper saying, I can't review it because I know who this is. And there are some pros and cons related to your status and the status of your institution. But once your paper is conditionally accepted, absolutely promote your paper. You can also post the accepted version, usually to your website, right? You have a personal website, right? So people can find you and know that you exist. You can post a version of it that was the version that was accepted before they put it all into the journal formatting. And that will make it available to people if you're publishing something that has a paywall in a journal that has a paywall. Tweet your paper once it's accepted. You know, I am a little bit old-fashioned, I know, but one of the things that I was advised to do, and I did when I had my first good publications, is I printed out a hard copy of it, and I put a little note to Kurt Valand, one of my heroes, and I sent him a snail mail copy of my paper. Now, you'll be like, well, why would I do that when I could just email them? Because I get a lot of emails. Kurt Valand gets a lot of emails. I don't get a lot of paper mail in my mailbox. If someone took the time to mail me a paper copy of their journal publication and it arrived in my office mailbox, I would be so excited to get mail and I would notice it and I would pay attention, right? So if you do have a big publication that comes out and there are a handful of people, like 4 or 5 people that are your heroes, that you really want to know about your work and you're really proud of your paper, by all means, send them a copy, right? Because then they're going to know about your work. I'm getting there, so we can have some questions and you can ask questions about some of these tips and things. What about your response memo? So you've gotten a revise and resubmit invitation, and now it's time to prepare your revisions and submit a cover memo that goes with your paper back to the editors and the reviewers. Well, a couple of things here. One is if you need more time, ask for it, right? So most of the times when you get an R&R invitation, it'll say, we expect the revised version in 3 months or in 4 months or 2 months. They want to publish your paper. If you need more time to do it right, ask for more time. Just email the journal email and say, I need a little bit more time, and get more time. So I don't, it feels odd to have to say that, but I do, because even someone who was at one of these Ivy Leagues had missed their deadline for revision. And it was like 6 months later. And all of a sudden I get an email from someone else saying, this other person missed their deadline, but they've had a really rough time. They've had all these health, like, you know, a whole big long thing. Can they still turn in their paper? And I'm like, of course. We wanted to publish it 6 months ago. We still want to publish it as long as it's good, right? So ask for more time if you need it. Think as carefully about how you organize and format your response memo as you do about what you say in the response memo, right? If you go on Twitter and blogs, you'll see lots of advice about how to prepare your response memo, and not all of that advice is good advice. Do not try to overwhelm your editor or reviewers by doing a 40-page response memo that is tedious and copies and pastes every single review into the memo and then answers it with a big long paragraph. Like, that is a surefire way to make everything take longer because the reviewers will have to spend a lot of time on it, aggravate everybody, irritate everybody. It is not effective. Although I have seen it as advice on the internet, like people on the internet say that this is the way to do things. I don't think that's true. Reviewers usually get a copy of all the reviews that were previously submitted. So you don't have to go through and repeat every single thing that was in all of the reviews, because they will get those usually attached to the invitation to do the to re-review the paper. So if you have extensive revisions, I have some suggestions for how to make it. So this is extensive revisions where maybe you have to redo the entire front end of the paper. They tell you this is good, but we don't like the framing. The framing needs to be broader or different. Or you need to add a bunch of literature. If you have to do so many revisions that you're essentially rewriting most of the paper, then the reviewers and everyone are going to have to reread the whole paper. So it's even more important that you make your memo easy to read and digest. So my advice in these instances would be to, instead of copying and pasting the entire kind of reviewer one said this, give me reviewer one said this, give me your summary of it, and then tell me exactly where you made those revisions. So if you go, you know, the reviewer said I needed to discuss the research by Dion. Okay, then on page 4, in lines 50 through 60, I added a discussion of Dion's work. That's it. You don't need to put a copy and paste of the actual revisions that you did, because they're going to go to the paper. You told them exactly where in the paper they could find those changes. Another trick that not everyone does, but really makes it helpful, is to use color or formatting of the memo itself to make it easier for the editors to review and process. So what I mean by this is sometimes I've seen authors do things like the reviewer comments are in red and their responses are in green or dark blue, right? So that you can tell, or they're indented in a particular way. So what you want to do is you want to make it easy for the editors and the reviewers to see the concern, understand what it was, understand how you addressed it, and where to find the change in the paper itself. Response memos should never be longer than the paper. Sometimes they are, but they shouldn't be. Now, my advice would be different if you have minor revisions, right? Or if it's like after a first round and you're coming back a second round. If you only have a handful of things that you've been asked to address, then it is okay to go point by point, because the editors and reviewers are going to be kind of like looking for just those little changes, right? One kind of minor tip that I don't think people realize or think about is that often when you upload your paper to the editorial system and then download the version of it where you can like check and make sure that it looks right, often it will have added line numbers in the margin of the paper. It is super, super helpful to editors and reviewers if you take that extra step of uploading the final new version and then downloading it again, and then making sure that your response memo refers to the pages of the version that you upload with the line items, with the line numbers that have been added, because that's going to be very helpful to the editors and the reviewers. A question we get is, how do you get to become a reviewer? Because if you get to review for the APSR, you get to see all the reviews the other people did, and you get to see the decision letters, and you get to see and understand the process. Submit to the journal, and you automatically end up in their reviewer database. But you can also go in as if you're going to submit to a journal and create the whole profile and then just not submit a paper. And then you will be in the reviewer database. And so what you want to do, if that's what you're doing, you're trying to become a reviewer for the AJPS or the APSR, you want to be careful with the expertise areas that you choose and pick the ones that are as narrow as possible, because then that increases the chance that the database is going to match you to the paper if they're using the database to try to find reviewers. You also want to be visible online. You want to have a personal web page, probably not until after you've defended your prospectus and you're almost done with your PhD and you're kind of thinking about jobs and things like that. Set up your Google Scholar profile and put really narrow expertise fields, right? Like, so if your Google Scholar says comparative politics, you know, like there's going to be thousands of people that have more citations than you in comparative politics. But if you can identify a much narrower field or topic and put that in your Google Scholar profile, there's a good chance then that if an editor or an editorial assistant is looking for reviewers and they're using Google Scholar to try to find people, they might actually find you and ask you to review. But only after they've gone to your personal website and seen other things that you've published. Lower visibility journals really struggle to find reviewers. I once was talking to the editors of the International Political Science Review, and they were telling me that they have to invite 15 people to get 2 good reviews. So if you want experience reviewing, just so that you can understand how the process works, potentially you can email lower visibility journals, tell them what your expertise is and your background, and they may be willing to add you to their reviewer database, particularly if you're an advanced PhD student, right? You're writing up your findings, you're about to graduate, or you've recently graduated. Do you need a cover letter? I don't know. I've heard both things. I never looked at them. I never paid attention to them, but some other editors did. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to spend a whole lot of time. What's most upsetting is that sometimes we would read a cover letter and the cover letter would do a better job than the abstract of telling us what the paper was about and why it was important. And that's really disappointing. I would use the cover letter mainly if you have any special circumstances. And what do I mean by special circumstances? You're trying to submit something that's part of a book manuscript. You're trying to submit something that you're also trying to publish in Portuguese. Most journals will not publish work that has appeared elsewhere. Like full stop. They just, if it's appeared somewhere else, we don't want it. We're not going to consider it for publication. In contrast, journals will often give you permission to publish a translation of your article or include portions of your article in a book later. Right? So you can't do the reverse. You can't get your book published and then try to publish a chapter in a journal, but you can publish a journal article. And then usually the licensing agreements for your journal articles will include a provision that allows you to use that material again in your own future works, like a book. You also want to be really careful about doing all of this, because you want to make sure if you're going to publish something in an English language journal and then you want to publish it in Portuguese as well, that you're being totally transparent with all the editors and publishers about that, and that everyone knows and it's on the up and up. And then on your CV, you also want to be very, very clear about what is a translation and not try to count something as a second or an extra publication when really it's a translation of something that already appeared before. You also want to take care to not publish the same paper twice, or something called salami publishing, which is where you take a big project and then publish as many small pieces as you can out of it, when really some of those should ideally be published together. So that's something that we had happen at the APSR often, that people would publish the results of an experiment in a very high profile non-political science journal like Science or Nature or PNAS. And then they would want to come publish another version of it in the APSR. But often the data methods, almost everything was the same, except for the framing. And in those instances, we were not interested in publishing those papers because the core data and findings had already been published somewhere else. So you want to kind of, if you're not sure, talk to your advisors, talk to your colleagues, ask the journal editors. I'm almost done. Hang in there. A couple of last points. How long should it take? When can I email a journal to ask about my submission because it's been a long time? Desk rejects should take no more than a month. If you've submitted something, and most systems, if you log back in to the journal submission interface, you can see whether or not it's with an editor or if it's out for review. If you have that ability in the system, you can kind of monitor the progress of your submission. And if it's been a month and it still says with editor, that likely means that they haven't sent it out or they hadn't made an initial decision yet. And it's okay to email the journal and politely say, I submitted this a month ago. Can you give me an update? I had a paper once that was submitted to a Latin American Studies journal, and I didn't hear for 3 months. And I finally emailed them and they were like, oh, we're sorry. The editor that we assigned the paper to went on leave and we forgot to reassign it to someone else. So we're going to reassign it now. At which point I was like, you know what, never mind. I'll go publish it somewhere else because you don't have your kind of editorial house in order, right? Peer review ideally should take no more than 3 months. So if you've submitted something and it's gone out for review and it's been 3 months and you haven't heard anything, it is totally acceptable to politely write to the journal and ask if they have an update on your paper. At the same time I say all of this, at smaller journals, like International Political Studies Review, where they have to contact 15 people before they can get anyone to agree to review your paper, it may take them longer to review your paper. So, you know, you can still inquire, but don't be surprised if they say, we're still waiting on reviews. Nada gave you a bunch of information from an earlier journal article about journals' turnaround times. And that's really useful, but they can change a lot depending on who's in charge of the journal. Smaller journals may not publish editorial reports, but the big journals will. Those that have like sponsors or organizations that pay for the journal, like the APSR, the AJPS, JOP, they usually require the editors to publish annual reports, and that's where we report all of this information. So you should, if that's a concern, like you're on the job market, you're on the tenure clock, there's a time constraint, you might be able to find that information from the publicly available documents. You can also ask other people, you know, in your network if they have experience. I'm going to skip over these next slides because I'm going to circulate these so that you can have them and you can kind of like look at it later. I'm going to also skip over this, although I'm going to talk about this real quick. Just because it was mentioned earlier, this Qualis or Quali and their system. Just kind of big picture, how journals are ranked. There are a lot of different organizations that rank journals and keep track of metrics for journals. Here are a couple of the big ones. These two are, Simago is based in Spain and Cielo I'm not sure exactly where it's based, but these have a larger collection of Spanish and Portuguese journals in them. The way they work usually is the organizations have some set of criteria that they use to decide which journals they're going to include in their corpus of journals to track. And then once they have those journals that they've agreed to track, they usually organize the journals into different disciplinary lists. And then they also calculate metrics for the journals that often use primarily that their own corpus to calculate the metrics. What I mean by that is if Clarivate is including a journal in the Web of Science and giving it rankings and counting citations, it's only counting citations by other journals in that same system. So it's not counting citations that happen in outside journals. So that's why it's important. Their business models are often selling data and related services to universities and publishers, which is why sometimes it can be difficult to get access to these types of metrics if your university doesn't subscribe to them. I think part of the reason Google Scholar has become popular is because it doesn't have those types of subscription requirements. From the point of view of like English language journals, the two most widely cited are the Clarivate's Journal Citation Reports, Journal Impact Factor, although they do have a new indicator they came out with in the last couple of years called the Journal Citation Index, which is normalized and considered to be much more comparable across fields. And then there's Elsevier's Scopus metrics. They have something called Cite Score. I would say that Elsevier is, their product is a little bit less popular than Clarivate. So there are different lists that you can look at to get rankings. National governments also have ranking systems, and Quali, you'll see, actually does reference Impact Factor, Google Scholar, and Cite Score as part of the indicators. And the Quali system puts journals into kind of a rank order categories based on a set of criteria that includes both these indicators and some local criteria. The result is that there's actually not a great correlation between impact factor and Quali ranking. The correlation is 0.48. So it's statistically significant, but it's not very strong. There are a lot of journals that are in the political science list that are not in the Quali political science list. The Quali list includes lots of things that are not in that other list. So if you're trying to kind of maximize your visibility and impact beyond Brazil, my advice would be to, you might use this for certain things, for figuring out kind of which is going to get you a raise or something once you have a job, perhaps. But you want to probably use broader metrics to think about high visibility versus low visibility in general. The good news is, though, and this is what I'm going to close with, is that if you do publish in an English language journal, you're likely to have similar impact to people that are not Brazilian. So basically what I did here was I just did a kind of quick and dirty test. I collected all the articles published in one of the journal citation reports lists. So basically what I did was I took the journal citation reports, which is the impact factor list. I took their list of journals. I took all the ISSNs, the number that identifies the journal. And then I went to the Dimensions API. Dimensions is another company that sells this type of data. They're the ones that do altmetrics. And I queried the API and got all the articles published in all of those journals since 2019. And one of the things that it gives back to me when I ask for all the data about all the articles published in those journals is it tells me where are the authors affiliated, what country they're affiliated with. So then I just went through and asked, is Brazil one of the countries listed for the authors of this paper? Yes, no. And then I calculated the average number of citations and the average altmetric score, which is this like attention score, like how much attention a paper has gotten on Twitter and blog posts in the news. And so it turns out that, yes, if there's a Brazilian author, there tends to be slightly fewer citations and slightly lower altmetric. But the good news is that those differences are not statistically significant, right? So you can have the same kind of impact, the same type of citations as other scholars that are from Europe or North America by publishing in these journals, even as a Brazilian. That's my kind of like happy ending to the story and the motivation. So I went on for much longer than I told Nada and Lorena and Rebecca that I would. But I added a whole bunch of tips and tricks and things like that. And I'm hoping that we get to talk about some of these things and that you have other questions. And I look forward to reading the abstracts and sending you feedback on those. So I'm going to stop sharing now and happy to discuss.
Michelle, thank you so much for sharing this helpful information with us and for ending on such a positive note too. It was really great. We have 5 minutes left maximum, so we have time for perhaps one question.
I am so sorry. I completely misunderstood. I thought we had until 3:30 or 2:30 your time.
It's 3:45 now. So, but it's fine. It was great. Yeah. We were super lucky. I was taking lots of notes and I'm looking forward to reading the presentation too.
I thought we had like another 30 minutes. Oh, well, sorry.
Question? Your presentation was so clear that I think, no one has questions.
Everyone's tired. Lorena has something, a question or a comment.
So Michelle, this was awesome. It was super helpful. I think one of the things that you didn't comment on, but I wanted to ask your opinion is, you sent your paper and you got really bad reviews, and you think that the reviewer, it was really unfair, or you got a desk reject and you feel like they didn't even read the paper or they don't understand the paper. What's your thoughts on how often is it that it's good to complain and to request or to say something? And if you have any views on that.
Yeah, we at APSR, we implemented an appeal process. So we actually had a formal process for appeals. Not most journals do not. I think it's important to pause and reflect and make sure that you actually say the things that you think you say. Sometimes I think authors think their paper says something that the reader doesn't capture, right? So I would say one piece of advice would be to have someone that you respect take a look at your paper and look at the reviews and see if they agree with you that there's misunderstanding here. Because the more common issue is not so much that the reviewers didn't read it or the editors didn't read it, is that it wasn't actually clear, that you thought you were saying something or making an argument, but in fact, it was not clear. At the same time, as long as it's respectful and well argumented and laid out clearly, reviewers, or not reviewers, but editors, I think will acknowledge that they might have made a mistake or misunderstood or something of the sort. I can think of examples myself where an author complained or came back. And in some instances, like 1, 2, I was like, yeah, I'll send it back to the reviewers that this is, maybe they didn't read it carefully. I often had to do a lot of work in those instances to go look at the papers and kind of adjudicate between the authors and the editors, the reviewers, when they disagreed. So I think the most important thing in those cases is to be respectful and to be methodical in how you approach it. So I would also say, don't wait 3 months, but also don't do it right away. Give yourself a week or two to calm down, to think about it, to consult with some other people, have them look at what you received, what you submitted, and your memo that you're going to send in beforehand to make sure that it's all very, very clear. I think it's harder with desk rejects because a lot of times when editors desk reject something, they might not actually tell you exactly why they desk rejected, because maybe they didn't want to be too harsh. So I know there were some instances where there were papers that were just really not well written, not clear enough, they didn't use the right types of methods. They just weren't very good. And those were actually papers where I said less, because I was like, I don't know what to say here. I can't say this was just a bad paper. And so that can be really hard. So sometimes you don't get much feedback back, and it might be because the editors don't know what to say, because it's so far out of what you expect. But yeah, I think it's not unprecedented, and people do that, do appeal or question, mostly when they're coming from the Ivy League and have a set of privilege that makes them want to do that. So most of our appeals actually came from people that were in very privileged positions.
So unfortunately, we have to end the session.
I'm so sorry.
So much, Michelle. Thank you, Lorena, for being here virtually. It was great. Yeah, it was super helpful. And it's nice that we're going to be able to share the presentation with participants, because I think they can, there's a lot of very helpful information there and detailed information. Thank you very much.
Enjoy the rest of your meeting.
Thank you. Thank you.